The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. On this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Knowing How to Know by Idries Shah. Real and imitation Sufi groups. Like anything else which becomes well known and well thought of, the Sufi study group is constantly imitated. Few of such imitations are intentionally spurious. By far the largest number are based on the idea which also underlies such apparently different activities as sympathetic magic and fashion. If I look like it, I can, in some way, become it. Sometimes this concept takes the unwitting form of, if I can think about it, I can make it happen. We must avoid magical thinking. Religious thinking requires one to become worthy of something. Magical thinking tries to cause or to create effects. I came across an example of how far the human mechanism of rationalization can go towards the absurd 20 or more years ago, when leaders of a large number of study groups in Europe and America approached me, seeking advice on what and how to teach. I first asked, in surprise, how long these groups had been at work, and how they had managed to keep going without any real content or any idea how to teach. They had existed like that for up to 40 years. But on what basis, I wondered aloud. Well, you see, we heard that the source of the teaching was in the East. We reasoned that if we formed centers of study here, the real teachers would hear of us and would be attracted. In fact, we were told this by our leaders. It seemed logical at the time. We reasoned. At first I thought that these remarks were intended as a joke, but when I laughed I only found that it distressed these honest but wholly misguided folk. The will to power may be unacceptable to most people, but when it is entirely unconscious, that is even more bizarre. They were trying to make things happen. You may not think that the people I mention were dishonest, but what else are we to call them? First, they spoke frankly and openly to me, admitting that they knew next to nothing. Second, they even told their disciples that they were waiting for the message from the Eastern teachers. And the pupils themselves, many of them highly intelligent people, saw nothing strange in the theory. Yet to any halfway lucid person, surely, the theory could be paraphrased thus. Somewhere in the East, we know not where, there is a body of people who have a special advanced knowledge of man. These people have cultivated this knowledge for eons, and they have schools and systems through which it is taught. Engaged as they are in pursuing this activity for the good of humanity, they carry on the teaching in the way which is necessary for its fulfillment. It had never, I gathered, occurred to any of these good people to think that, given the existence of such people as they constantly spoke of, the Eastern teachers must surely have the means to project the teaching wherever they like, or, at all events, wherever it was necessary or advisable. It was a strange experience to see the faces of the eager esotericists when I said, "Your Eastern teachers must be a rum lot if they have all that wisdom and are incapable of carrying on their job without you." I had visions of a parallel, equally ludicrous hypothetical situation, of the good people of the Kentish village near which I lived, collecting together and agreeing that they would like some advanced knowledge, let us call it microelectronics, and then trying to puzzle their way around in such information as they had of it, until such time as some technologist, stimulated by their heroism, should take pity on them. There are still hundreds of groups like the Seekers I have told you about, and they have many thousands of members. That is one form of imitation group. By far the commonest, however, derive their energy from a more familiar, though less clearly articulated, source than a mere lack of common sense. They are thought to be Sufi groups, but their dynamic, that which holds them together, is something quite different. It is the unperceived contract between people who want to be in a social group and those who want to exercise, most often unconsciously, leadership. This phenomenon is now well known and documented by workers in the fields of sociology, anthropology, and psychology, but it is not yet well understood by the population at large. The reason is not difficult to find. When a number of people combine for a common purpose, it is always taken as axiomatic that they are brought together and kept united by the label, the apparent aim of the group. The reality is the other way about. If the desire to group were not there, nobody would think of forming a group. If the alleged purpose of the group were not there, another would be adopted. It is as simple as that. One reason why this knowledge, fascinating and important as it is, and verified by much sociological research in the West, is so slow in percolating down to the ordinary person is this: people cherish their groups. They also have a genuine interest in the avowed aims of the group. Anyone who seems to them to be deriding or in any way threatening the group, even by raising legitimate questions about it, is perceived as hostile. Psychologically speaking, then, there is a factor in group behavior which can have serious consequences for the group and its members, the most conspicuous one being that people find it hard to get away from the group, even when it is not desirable for them to stay in it. There is an added complication. Groups are often very valuable and carry on excellent and important work. Because of this, there is a subconscious impression that a specific group must be good, must be useful. This is fortified by the fellow feeling which often accompanies group membership. People are deriving satisfactions from being members. Yet such groups are not Sufic ones, whatever their members may imagine. So if someone comes along and says, "This group is only a social phenomenon," he will be told, "You cannot understand how valuable it is to us. We feel something which you do not." In these circumstances, the group becomes a self-protecting entity. But of course, it is not a spiritual one, no matter what its members may imagine. And it is imagination at work, no matter what it feels like. Well, it may be asked, and I have often been asked it, what is wrong with that? One man put it in this way: I accept that group behavior is rooted in instinct, but this surely is only the form and not the substance. People need that instinct or they would never combine at all. We should be glad that the tendency exists. People may form a group to practice, for instance, first aid and do a lot of good. How would they manage it if they did not have a tendency towards concerted conception, planning, and action? The statement, though articulate and seemingly reasonable, is in reality based on incoherent thought and lack of information. Far from being connected with higher consciousness, it badly needs an injection of lower, normal consciousness. You see, I was talking about Sufi learning groups, not about first aid. There are any amount of non-Sufic efforts which can be carried out by groups originating with and making use of the natural human tendency to combine, and this should be encouraged. The incoherence comes in when it is assumed that there is only one kind of group possible, and that this is the best way to attempt anything. Sufic groups are highly specialized entities, and certainly no job for amateurs. Perhaps you recognize the logic within the incoherence. It is our old friend, the logic of the man who says, "I admit that I do this from habit or instinct, but look at what a lot of good I do, and besides there is no other way to do it." Another form of this kind of fallacious thinking runs, "If God had wanted us to fly, he would have given us wings." Besides, no Sufi will say that there should be a group which is not based on natural human proclivities, or which should be completely other than any familiar human group. What he will say, however, is that no Sufi group can usefully exist unless the group mentality operates to the minimum. For this to be possible, for a Sufi group to come into being, those in the group must, as a priority, know about groups and know how to reduce the compulsive element inherent in the drive towards grouping. So, a true group, in the Sufi sense, is one which has the minimum of groupiness about it. Imitation Sufi groups are in-groups. A good test is to see whether complete strangers, with no esotericist interests at all, feel at ease in the group. If they do not, it is not a Sufic group. Furthermore, a Sufi group is not a permanency. It may be dissolved, recombined, suspended for months or even years, so that the unwelcome characteristics of a group are avoided. The next characteristic of a real Sufi group is that its members are chosen and harmonized so as to develop the maximum learning advantage from the group. To do this requires not a touching faith in the Eastern masters, who may be attracted, but a thorough Sufic knowledge of harmonization. Sufi study groups are not recruitment groups. They are not collections of people who have all answered a newspaper advertisement or formed a group after reading a book or hearing a lecture, or because they are related to someone, or have been made interested in the Sufi way, or people who simply seek a group. Such non-Sufic groups may be recognized, even by complete outsiders, by the personality conflicts which arise within them. People in a Sufi group are those assigned to a group by someone who knows what this really means, and that means by a Sufi. And a Sufi is someone who has completed the learning, who is the end product, not a learner in any sense. Seekers are not Sufis. Any other form of group whose members imagine that they are following Sufi study will have as little chance of acquiring anything of Sufic knowledge as any collection of people, like my villagers trying to understand technology, who lack the basic requirement of fundamental guidance. In this sense, it will now be obvious, a Sufic group is a specialized one, something very different from a random assemblage of people, something distinct from people simply sharing a similar outlook or having similar objectives. For this reason alone, no group can be called Sufi which is not organized by a Sufi. It should be noted here that Sufis are not claiming that the Sufi group is some way superior to any other kind of group, but it is simply quite different. You can learn to be a Sufi, if a member of a group, only in a Sufi group, which is not the same as saying that any Sufi wants to try to turn people into Sufis. But a Sufi is obliged to make clear the difference between Sufically purposeful groups and others, however attractive or apparently determined these others may be. There is another common, though often unwitting, rationalization found among would-be seekers. Having been informed that a Sufi group should be one directed by a Sufi, they promptly backtrack and rename themselves preparatory groups or some such label. The name may change, but the reality does not. You may be full of goodwill, want to inform people about Sufi matters, know little, but think that you can do little harm by giving talks, having meetings, and so on. But this activity is full of pitfalls, which are far more numerous and objectionable than the advantages. Wisdom does not come out of ignorance, and the matter does not even end there. Out of ignorance and self-deception may come a great deal of harm. The least that can happen is that imitation groups will proliferate, because there is nothing which can be done to prevent this. The test for those who are really interested to learn what can be learnt from the Sufi way is easy. It is exactly the same as the test which common sense applies to the learning of anything. Does the would-be learner want to learn what there is to be learnt, in the manner, in the company, and with the materials, timing, and methods which are necessary to the time, place, situation of the pupil, and the learning? Or does the learner want to proceed in ways which he or she feels are the right ones? Increase your necessity is a Sufi phrase, speaking, you should observe, not of a desire, but of a necessity. Most people extend the wrong side of themselves to Sufi teaching. They may be seeking, but they are seeking what the Sufis are not able to give. There is another bizarre element which can creep into study groups, a sort of poison which does not originate in the Sufi attitude or teaching, but in the contaminant of the world. This is when someone gets hold of the idea that the Sufi ideas have to be promoted, and forms a group while not yet fitted for the task. Such a person is easy to identify by the use of common sense. Unfortunately, one of the first things that such a person does is to oppose common sense. Such people will take, for instance, our books, which are publicly distributed, and set people to study them. The next step is to oppose rational interpretations of their contents by saying, or implying, that there is a different, hidden, special meaning in this material. Or it might be put thus: what is written here is not intended to be understood as it stands. Or even, this is a test. They tend to like the idea of a test. But Sufi tests are never carried out in a way which is ever discerned by the pupil, and never at all in a preparatory group. Anyone who teaches but says that he or she does not understand, or who says that things in our published materials have a special and different meaning from the overt one is, at best, very self-deluded. Another common statement or implication from such an unsuitable individual is, we do not understand, but understanding will come if we persist. This kind of person is particularly difficult to deal with because he or she is suffering from a concealed desire to dominate. This is concealed both from the individual in question and also from the group, under layers of greed and self-deception. Only the restoration of real humility can change that. That, in turn, requires repentance of the desire to dominate. This is usually too much to ask from those who have developed a taste for it. People say, this person is so dedicated, is taking nothing from the group. How can he or she be deluded or want power? This question ignores the fact that there are other things to be taken from situations than, say, money or overt power. Generally, one can recognize such a self-deceived, if to some plausible, person because he or she gives the impression of acting under the instructions of someone else, the teacher, living or dead. There is a familiar pattern in the life of this kind of person. More often than not, he or she has tremendous personal and social difficulties, constantly having problems which are attributed to some kind of test or cross to bear. All that is happening is that this individual is ascribing a different cause to events, and the pattern continues, sometimes for many years. Luckily, such a situation can sometimes be retrieved. But such a retrieval partly depends upon the group leader recognizing his or her need to learn before one can lead. There is a gap in such a person's knowledge. Until that gap is filled, there will be no progress. And the onus is not only on the group leader to reform. In one sense, the members of the group are also guilty. Their desire to be involved in something important, special, or promising, their allowing a sense of dependency to become too strong, causes the suspension of the common sense which the Sufis need before progress can be made. I have come across many people who have said, but I have only persisted with this group because I really want to learn and can find no other opportunity. That sounds all right to the person who is saying it, But how does he or she explain the fact that there are thousands, perhaps millions of people who are just as interested and who do not stay tied to such unsuitable company? This phenomenon is not confined to supposedly Sufic groups. Indeed, it is rarer among them than among all kinds of esotericist groupings. And as any sociologist will tell you, this kind of social group will continue to be formed almost everywhere, simply because it makes use of the dependency wish and wonder-seeking characteristics which are present in everybody. The Sufi tries to reduce these characteristics. The esotericist feeds off them. He or she seeks wonders, promptings, meanings, and messages. This attitude is highly undesirable. Apart from certain natural proclivities, what are the factors which produce such problems among people who are often otherwise quite sensible? There is, interestingly enough, only a single reason. We have found it to be a constant wherever we have come across the peculiarities which I have been describing. The reason is, quite simply, that the people involved have failed to stick to a single curriculum. They have collected all kinds of esoteric, religious, and similar fragments from all kinds of sources and tried to link them, or at all events to include them in their thinking. In other words, they have attempted to do the reverse of what any lucid teaching system requires. Sufi study does not differ from any other purposeful and acceptable teaching in any area. It requires the student to follow a series of carefully selected and graded steps without incorporating imagination, assumptions, materials from elsewhere, or concepts originating with other times, places, and people. In a word, it is a complete system whenever projected. This approach does not appeal to those who, while imagining that they want to learn or to progress, in reality merely want to spin on their own axes. They have effectively removed themselves from any real teaching or learning. An assumption underlying all human cultures. All human cultures, no matter how diverse they may appear to superficialists, are ultimately based upon exactly the same premise. That is, that greed is wrong, and that renunciation, as the opposite of greed, must be right. The cultures continue in their automatic reasoning, as one can see, not from their arguments but by their actions, a far better method of assessment, that if total greed is totally objectionable, total renunciation must be totally praiseworthy. In basing themselves upon such an idea, the cultures are, of course, acting in a manner exactly similar to the useless way of thinking of the infant or the savage who thinks, one aspirin cures a headache, 1,000 aspirins will give me illumination. The truth lies in the middle. It is not contested that greed is destructive, something which can easily be illustrated even by such apparently bizarre logical extensions as saying, if one person's greed reached its total maximum, there would be no food left for anyone else to eat, and then he would be alone. Greed might in that way become abolished, since consumption would not be at anyone's expense, but humanity would die out. Smaller groupings of people, however, have almost always existed who have realized that the barbarian methods of thought are not only inefficient, but insufficient, and create more problems than they solve. It is these groupings which have communicated the much more sophisticated patterns of thought which all current cultures can easily be seen to lack. All members of current cultures, in exercising their capacity to understand this patchy development of their thinking patterns, must realize that they should never be expected to abandon customary methods of thought. If they were to do so, they would become incomprehensible to their fellows, and this would seriously disturb the possibility of their being able to continue to live amicably and successfully among them. But this does not exclude the possibility that the refined barbarian can add to the dimensions of his understanding even if he cannot make these dimensions understood to his fellows within the impoverished thought structures wherein they demand to be informed. But before he tries to add to his breadth of knowledge and his objectivity, the individual must ask himself whether he really does desire to do so. I say this because it is entirely obvious that most people, no matter what they imagine, do not in fact want to learn more. If they did, they would have been able to observe at least some of the absurdities and the shortcomings of their present patterns of thinking. There is no real evidence that this has occurred in the past few thousand years on any significant scale. Nobody who tries to increase this knowledge in the human milieu can remain unaware that, among those who believe that they are trying to increase their knowledge, perceptions, and awareness, only a very small number are actually trying to do so. The rest are using the same words, but they are in fact demanding certain satisfactions from the enterprise, social, personal, and community diversion being among the most obvious. Acceptance. A characteristic of almost all human societies is the general belief, hallowed by institutions and uncritically accepted, that something must be convenient, plausible, believed, allowed by precedent, accepted as true, capable of proof within confines laid down by self-appointed authorities or their successors, and admitted by some established body of experts, otherwise it is not allowed to be true. The fact is, of course, as we can immediately see once we pause to analyze it, an idea, scheme, or almost anything else really needs no other qualification than that it is true. Rule: truth is not dependent upon whether any given individual, machine, or body of people regard it as true or otherwise. Attention. Man seeks attention because he needs it. It is part of human nutrition. The obtaining and employment of attention follows a nutrition pattern. Too little attention causes symptoms of deprivation. More than a certain amount fills up man in that he cannot perceive other things. Man is at a stage where he craves attention and does not realize it. It is not the object which he desires, but the attention derived from the object. He is like a child, savage, or animal that has a need which disables him because he has not organized it. Human beings who had not developed regular eating habits would be similarly inefficient, breaking off all kinds of activities to have food. Those people who give and take the necessary quality, quantity, and variety of attention are incomparably more effective and free than those whose lives are dominated by attention craving, but who have no clear picture of the situation. Notice. People who claim that they are not getting the notice which they deserve would not behave as they do if this were true. Equally confused are those who claim that they do not want attention and who do. When they are given what they say they want, they often reject it, because what they wanted all the time was attention. But it should not be called attention, since they like to feel that it is something more important. A real community. Ours is a real community. Ordinary communities come into being, grow, develop, die, and regenerate in certain very similar patterns. People think that these communities are different from one another because of their outward shapes. But they have characteristics which utilize human tendencies like self-esteem, greed, the desire to receive approval, or failing that, attention of any sort, and so on. Unable or unwilling to resist a community's demands for these and other satisfactions, almost all the leaders of human groups have, knowingly or otherwise, made use of them. The inevitable result has been that almost all human groupings, whatever their overt aims, structurally resemble one another. They are, or rapidly become, manifestations of the same characteristics. They only masquerade as being in search of knowledge, or as uplifting the people, or as spreading information, even as increasing wealth or productivity. This is because they are only able to appear to do such things so long as the individuals and mass of the community are gaining or being promised some lower satisfaction. This fact has been observed only too well by sociologists and psychologists. It is so marked that these experts have gone so far as to believe that no human community can come about, progress, or survive unless it panders to the lower human proclivities. If this were so, there would be no hope for the human race. While it is understandable that at a lower level human egoism may be harnessed to social action, do something good and you will feel good, the higher philosophy must take effect at some point. If it does not, if a higher community does not develop, nothing can happen beyond the social common denominator. The Sufi Enterprise concentrates upon developing a knowledge in the human being that the satisfactions of his accustomed self may be legitimate in smaller things. He cannot use them as a springboard to higher understanding. Our community remains faithful to the higher development of man only to the extent to which its individual and group studies can recognize the possibility of the existence of a higher aim than disguised personal satisfactions. Are men machines? People do not like being called machines. And yet most people are not even machines in lacking faculties for evaluating the qualitative nature of experience. Instead of being able to perceive the spectrum of influences in a single experience, they feel it transcendental if it moves them. Unlike a machine, too, the human being has no switching gear to turn experience on and off, and man has no means of engendering experience except by the most hazardous trial and error ones, such as throwing himself into random situations or ingesting drugs. One of the purposes of a real esoteric training is first to acquire lower control such as a machine might have, before higher controls can be attained. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.